He took revenge on his neighbor for harming the only friend he had, his dog. The wind howled through the dusty streets of Kibera, a sprawling neighborhood on the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya. The streets were alive with the sounds of life. Children laughing, vendors shouting, music playing from makeshift speakers. But amidst this vibrant chaos stood a house that was eerily silent. It was a modest home, built from corrugated metal sheets, weathered by time and neglect. Malcolm Cato, a 75-year-old retired soldier, lived there alone. Alone, except for Bruno. Bruno was more than just a dog. He was Malcolm's last connection to the world, the only living soul that kept him company after years of loss. The old man had once had a family, a wife, a son, but war had taken them from him decades ago. Now, in his final years, his only source of warmth was the wagging tail and soulful eyes of his faithful German shepherd. Every morning, Malcolm would step out of his house with Bruno trotting beside him, greeting the familiar faces of the neighborhood. The local shopkeeper, Mama Wanjuru, would always chuckle, "You and that dog, inseparable like the sun and the sky." Malcolm would simply nod and pat Bruno's head. He was never much for words. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared this fondness for the old soldier and his dog. One man in particular hated Bruno with a passion, his next-door neighbor, Larry Okoth. Larry was a brute of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always wearing a scowl, he had a reputation for violence. Most of the people in the neighborhood avoided him, and for good reason. His house was just a few feet away from Malcolm's, but their worlds couldn't have been more different. While Malcolm lived a quiet life, Larry was a man of chaos. His home was always filled with noise, loud music, shouting, the clinking of beer bottles. He ran illegal gambling games, and people whispered that he had connections with criminals. From the very first day, he had made it clear that he despised Bruno. "Keep that filthy mud away from my yard, old man," he had barked the first time Bruno dared to step a paw near his fence. Malcolm never responded. He had seen men like Larry before, bullies who thrived on intimidation. But that didn't stop the tension from growing. At first, it was just verbal insults. Larry would shout at Malcolm every time Bruno barked. Then came the petty acts of malice, Larry throwing rocks at the dog, tossing garbage into Malcolm's yard. One day, Malcolm found a piece of raw meat near his doorstep, covered in tiny blue pellets. Rat poison. His blood turned to ice. He knew exactly what this meant. He stormed over to Larry's house. "Was this your doing?" Malcolm's voice was low, controlled, but his eyes burned with anger as he held up the poisoned meat. Larry smirked. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man. Maybe you should keep that beast on a leash." Malcolm clenched his fists but said nothing. He knew men like Larry. Confronting them with words was useless. So he walked away. And for a while, things seemed to settle. The poisoned meat had been a warning, but Bruno was safe, for now. Until the night, everything changed. It was a warm, humid evening. Malcolm sat outside, watching the sky shift from orange to deep blue. Bruno lay beside him, his head resting on Malcolm's foot. Then, a distant thud. Bruno's ears perked up. He growled, then bolted toward the alley behind the house. "Bruno," Malcolm called after him, rising to his feet. The dog never ignored his calls. But tonight, he didn't come back. Malcolm grabbed a flashlight and hurried after him, his heart pounding. He searched the alley, the nearby streets, calling Bruno's name. Nothing. By midnight, Malcolm was frantic. He knocked on doors, asked neighbors, but no one had seen anything. Then, as he turned back toward home, he saw it. A dark shape lying near the edge of the dirt road. His breath caught in his throat. He ran, and there, in the dim glow of his flashlight, he found Bruno's lifeless body. His fur was matted, his body limp. Beside him, Malcolm saw a half-eaten piece of meat, just like the one before. Poison. Malcolm sank to his knees. His hands trembled as he reached out, running his fingers through the soft fur. Bruno's eyes, once filled with so much life, were now glassy and still. For a long time, Malcolm just sat there, silent, numb. But deep inside, something began to stir, a darkness he had buried for years. He lifted his head and looked toward Larry's house. And for the first time in decades, Malcolm Cato felt the hunger for war again. Malcolm sat in the darkness of his home, staring at the empty space where Bruno used to lay. His hands trembled, not from old age, but from something else. Rage. Cold, unrelenting rage. Outside, The night was alive with distant laughter and music. The neighborhood carried on as if nothing had happened. But for Malcolm, the world had changed forever. Bruno was gone, and someone had to pay for it. He knew who was responsible. Larry Okoth. The bastard had been trying to get rid of Bruno for months. Now he had finally done it. Malcolm's fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't a young man anymore, but he had not forgotten how to fight. The only question now was, how? Most people in Kibera knew Malcolm as an old, quiet man. What they didn't know was that he had once been a soldier in the Kenyan military, part of an elite reconnaissance unit. He had fought in wars, seen things that haunted his dreams. He had learned one thing. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about patience, strategy, precision. And so, Malcolm began to watch. He spent the next 2 days observing Larry's every move. When he woke up, where he went, who he spoke to, his weaknesses. Malcolm learned that Larry had a routine. Every night, Larry left his house at 8 p.m. to visit a local bar where he gambled. He usually came back drunk around midnight. And Malcolm also noticed something else. Larry was afraid of the dark. It was a moonless night when Malcolm made his first move. Larry was returning home, stumbling through the alleys, humming some off-tune song. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows. As he neared his door, a sharp scratching sound echoed from the darkness. Larry froze. He turned, scanning the empty street. Nothing. He muttered a curse and continued fumbling with his keys. Then, from behind him, a low, guttural growl. His body stiffened. He spun around, but there was no dog. Only silence. Sweat gathered on his brow. His eyes darted around, searching the shadows. The growl came again, closer this time. Larry backed up, fumbling with the lock. His fingers were shaking. Then, crack. A loud thud came from the alley. Larry bolted inside his house and slammed the door shut. He locked it, double-locked it, then sat down on the floor, panting. His hands were still shaking. For the first time in his miserable life, Larry felt fear. For the next 3 nights, the torment continued. Night 1. Larry woke up to the sound of scratching at his bedroom window. When he gathered the courage to look outside, there was nothing. Night 2. He found his front door wide open when he woke up, even though he was sure he had locked it. Night 3. A single paw print was left on his doorstep, drawn in red dust. Larry was unraveling. By the 4th night, he stopped sleeping altogether. He started drinking even more, keeping the lights on at all times. Malcolm watched from the shadows, satisfied. This was only the beginning. On the 5th night, Malcolm decided it was time for a personal message. He waited until Larry left for his usual gambling session. Then, he slipped into the house through an unlocked window. Larry's home was filthy. Empty beer bottles, cigarette ashes, and dirty clothes scattered everywhere. Malcolm didn't care about any of it. He pulled out a piece of old paper and wrote a single sentence. Bruno forgives you. But I don't. He placed the note on Larry's pillow and slipped back out into the night. When Larry returned home, he was already drunk. He stumbled through the door, rubbing his eyes. He collapsed onto his bed, then he saw it. The note. His drunken haze disappeared instantly. His breath caught in his throat. Someone had been inside his house. His hands started shaking as he reread the message. His mind raced. Was it Malcolm? Was it someone else? Was it Bruno? A chilling thought entered his mind. What if the dog's spirit had come back for revenge? Larry snapped. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey, chugged it, and ran to Malcolm's house, banging on the door. Old man, I know it's you, he shouted, his voice on the verge of hysteria. The door opened just a crack. Malcolm stood there, calm, expressionless. Larry's breath hitched. He had never really looked into Malcolm's eyes before. Now, staring at them, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. There was nothing human in Malcolm's gaze, only cold, unrelenting purpose. Malcolm spoke softly. You should leave, Larry, before it's too late. Then, he shut the door. Larry stood there, frozen, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. The fear had done its job. Larry was broken, but Malcolm wasn't finished yet. Now, it was time to end this. Permanently. Larry Okoth was unraveling. For the past week, he had barely slept. His face had grown gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. He jumped at the smallest noises, his fingers twitching even when he was alone. And worst of all, he could feel it. Something watching him. Something lurking in the shadows. At first, he thought it was the old man. But then came the dreams. In them, Bruno was still alive, staring at him, Not attacking, not growling, just watching. Larry would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of phantom growls still ringing in his ears. He needed a way out. Fast. And so, on the 7th night, Larry made a decision. He was going to kill Malcolm first. At 1 a.m., Larry stood outside Malcolm's house, a rusty machete clutched in his sweaty hands. His heart pounded as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the door. He had killed before. He had stabbed men in bar fights, had beaten people half to death for money. This would be easy. One quick slash to the throat. And then, it would all be over. But as he raised his hand to knock, something changed. The night around him felt wrong. The wind had died. The air was thick, suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally across the ground. And then, crack, a noise behind him. Larry whipped around, his breath hitching. Nothing. Only the silent street, empty save for the distant flicker of streetlights. Then, a whisper, right next to his ear. Go home, Larry. Larry staggered backward, swinging his machete wildly. But there was no one there. His blood turned to ice. Had he imagined it? No. He knew that voice. It was Malcolm. And that's when it hit him. This was a trap. Larry turned and ran. Not back home. He couldn't stay there anymore. Instead, he stumbled through the alleyways, panting, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. But as he ran, something felt off. The streets weren't right. The alleys weren't where they should be. Buildings he had passed 1,000 times looked different, twisted in ways he couldn't understand. And then he saw it. A familiar shape in the distance. A dog. It stood in the middle of the alley, unmoving. Larry's breath caught. It was Bruno. Impossible. Dead dogs don't come back. But it was there, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Larry took a step back. The dog tilted its head, watching him. Then it moved. Not running. Not attacking. Just walking forward. Slow. Deliberate. And Larry, without thinking, kept stepping back. 1 step. 2. 3. Until his foot hit empty air. Larry's world turned upside down. He was falling. His body crashed through dry branches, rocks scraping against his arms as he tumbled down. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Pain exploded through his ribs. He had fallen into a pit. A deep, narrow trench, dug into the earth like a grave. Gasping, he tried to stand, but a sharp spike of pain shot through his ankle. He was trapped. Above him, the sky was black, the stars blurred by the dust he had kicked up. And then, a shadow appeared at the edge of the pit. Larry's breath caught. Malcolm. The old man stood there, looking down at him. Expressionless. You should have left when I warned you, Malcolm said. Larry's pulse hammered. Please, he croaked. I didn't mean. Malcolm tilted his head. Didn't mean to kill him? His voice was calm. Too calm. Larry shook his head wildly. It was just a dog. Silence. And then Malcolm sighed. You don't get it, do you? He murmured. Larry swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. Please, just let me go. I swear I'll leave. Malcolm didn't answer. Instead, he tossed something into the pit. It landed with a soft thud beside Larry. He froze. A piece of rotting meat. Just like the one he had fed Bruno. His stomach twisted. Enjoy your meal, Malcolm said. Then he walked away, leaving Larry alone. In the darkness. With nothing but his fear. And the distant sound of dogs howling in the night. Larry Okoth was never seen again. A few days later, some children playing near the trench found something buried in the dirt. A machete. Rusted. Next to it, a single dog collar. Engraved with one word. Bruno. Malcolm, however, continued his life as if nothing had happened. Every evening, he sat outside his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Alone, but at peace. Because justice had been served.